Good, I'm guessing, afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the beta stage where we're going to be doing all things UX, CSS, understanding our users today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Again, on the back of your name badges, you've got the bingo, the treasure hunt, whatever you want to call it. Please go see our sponsors. They make this possible. And you can win some awesome headphones if you hand in your card before 4 o'clock this afternoon. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce to the stage now Amy Kapernick, who's going to be talking to us today about CSS Grid and what magic this is. I'm really looking forward to this one. Amy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Stacey, for that amazing intro. It feels really nice to have an introduction by someone who's in the same room as me. This isn't like us virtually on separate computers in separate countries. So good morning and welcome to CSS Grid. What is this magic? A little bit about myself. I am a front-end developer. I work for myself, which means I spend most of my time at the beach and the rest of it working from home in my pajamas. In case you can't tell from my accent, I have come all the way from Australia here. Yes, I think there's 2 of us here at this time, so it's really exciting to A, be allowed to leave the country, and B, know that I'm going to be allowed to go home again afterwards. I am based in Perth, Western Australia, which if you're not aware of, I actually spent a whole lot of time not even being able to leave my state the last few years. So our state border was closed and the idea of actually leaving Perth has been amazing to me. It's also super exciting to be here in Lithuania. This is my first time in Lithuania. It is a beautiful, Vilnius is beautiful. I'm assuming the rest of the country is beautiful as well. So I am very excited to actually be here in person. I, at home, am very heavily involved in the Perth tech community. I help organise a couple of meetup groups and am vice chair and director of conference content for a conference called DDD Perth, which is the largest tech conference in Australia. I also have a beautiful grey and white border collie who is no way, shape or form related to the content of this talk, but I like to include pictures of my dogs to just start off the talk on a good note. He is also very upset about the fact that I'm leaving him again, despite the fact that he likes my partner much more than me. He's apparently very upset that now he has to spend all day sleeping outside by himself, as opposed to when he spends all day sleeping outside by himself while I'm sitting in my office. Hugely different. Today, though, I'm going to be talking about CSS Grid, which, if you haven't heard of it, I appreciate the fact you've actually turned up to the session, and is a spec that came out to browsers a few years ago and revolutionized the way we do layouts on the web. But to start off, I want to tell you a little story. In the beginning, there was darkness and emptiness. And then Tim Berners-Lee said, "Let there be internet." Now, the internet was much simpler in these times. It was just HTML content on a page, similar to how we would see in a Word document. But pretty soon, everybody got sick of reading Times New Roman. And so Tim said, let the fonts and colours and sizes and positions be changeable. And then there was CSS. But before too long, this wasn't good enough either. We wanted to do more with our web pages. We wanted to do more with how they looked and felt. And so we discovered that you could use tables for layouts. This was really great because you could break the page up into a grid, you could merge cells into one another, you could put tables inside of tables to make more complex layouts. We finally had better control over how the content was being laid out on a page. The problem was, though, although tables inside of tables was okay, it wasn't so great when you had tables inside of tables, inside of tables, inside of tables. Then we entered the world of responsive web design, and this kind of thing made it really difficult to deal with. So we often had to build completely different websites for mobile as we did for desktop. So then we started using floats. Now, this was kind of good because it meant that we were back to following the separation of concerns principles that says that HTML is for our content and CSS is for the visual look and interface. But before too long, we found that floats weren't great either. You had to clear fix everything. There were a bunch more container divs being used to keep floating elements together or apart. And when you used media queries, you often had to do complex calculations and change or reset previous code. So there was a lot of using bang important, which just makes me cry. But by this point, Flexbox had arrived. And Flexbox was really great because it reduced a whole lot of the percentage math that we had to do. It reduced a number of the media queries that we needed, and we were finally able to vertically center content again, which we hadn't really been able to do since tables. We were finally able to get the functionality that we wanted from our CSS. We no longer needed to write massively complicated code or work with a lot of percentages, and our code was now more responsive than ever. But although Flexbox was good for flowing content in one direction, there was limited control on the cross-axis. And if you wanted to have gaps between elements, it tended to get a little complicated. And we needed to use negative margins. But things were looking up because we finally had a CSS spec that was built for layout. And we knew that something else was on the horizon. In 2017, CSS Grid launched in all new major browsers. Now, this actually happened in a way we'd never seen before. Rather than the spec being developed with browser prefixes, it was one of the first times it had been developed with feature flags, which meant as soon as it rolled out, there wasn't actually anything we had to do. We didn't have a whole lot of prefixes, and it was ready to go. CSS Grid also finally gave us everything we'd been asking for from CSS layouts. Like Flexbox, we were able to define a set of constraints and have the browser make the layout responsive. But we were now able to control the layout in both directions. With Grid, we could define different areas of the layout. We could define whether specific elements spanned across different areas, and we could dictate how the elements inside of the grid behaved. We were now able to reduce the code that we were writing, and even better, we could reduce the thinking needed to make our layout responsive. Now, one of the questions I often get as soon as I start talking about CSS Grid is, well, isn't this just tables? Didn't we already have this kind of thing with tables? Isn't Grid just a newer, fancier version of the table layout that we've been scoffing at for years? Now, the answer is no, otherwise I wouldn't be up here giving this talk. I'd be talking about tables. CSS Grid is specifically designed for layouts, whereas tables were a hack that we used to work our way around things. And again, I want to go back to the separation of concerns principles, which says that HTML is for our content and CSS is for how the content is laid out on the page. Now, I'm not saying that tables are a bad thing. Tables do still have a place. Like, for example, if you have a bunch of tabular data, that would probably be displayed inside of a table. There is still absolutely a place for table layouts. If you've spent any time building HTML emails, I'm very sorry, but that is unfortunately still table layouts. But Grid is not the same thing as tables, and tables do still have a place. CSS Grid also helps us to write more logical, semantical logical semantic HTML. We're no longer required to write our HTML based on how the page design should look. We can write our HTML based on the logical flow of the document and then use CSS to rearrange to how the design looks and feels. When this is done right, this actually means that our content can be more accessible and more usable for anybody who's using assistive technology or using reader mode or saving an article for later. So, to prove how amazing CSS Grid is, today we're going to build the layout of an app. And thanks to CSS Grid, mocking up this app not only takes less time, it takes less code. So, here we have the HTML structure of our app. We have a header, we have a navigation, we have an article, and a footer. So we're going to go through and build out the app. So we all know what happens now, right? We have nice clean HTML. Now we've got to go through and add a whole lot of clutter in to get it to work. Let's see how we go. So HTML looks a little bit like this. We have our header, our nav, our main, and our footer. And we're going to start off nice and easy, and we're going to set display grid on the body, which does pretty much nothing at this point. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to break our layout up into columns and rows. And so I've gone through and I've split our app up into 5 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which as you can tell are completely equally sized columns. These are clearly the exact same size, right? And we're then going to have 3 rows, a header, a main, and a footer row. So now that we know what it's going to look like, we've got 5 columns. So I'm going to go through and define the columns of the app. And to do that, I'm going to use a property called grid template columns. And so I'm going to define my 5 columns, same width, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. That's 5. Now, can anyone see an issue with this? I said we'd write less code. So instead, I'm going to write repeat 5, 200 pixels. Now the repeat function is something special for CSS Grid, which allows us to write the number of times we want to repeat it and the size of the column that we want to repeat. So for example, repeat 3, 200 pixels would give us 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. We can also repeat a pattern. So repeat 2 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths would be 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths, 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths. This is really great because it allows us to reduce the code that we're writing. So if I said repeat 5, 20%, what do you reckon I'd get? 5 columns, each 20% of the parent container. Now this is pretty good as well because it means if I resize the container, doesn't matter what size the window is, it's always going to be 20%. It's always going to take up 1/5 of the full width. However, if I go through and change the number of columns, I've then got to go through, like if I want 6 columns, what's 100% divided by 6? I don't want to do that. So instead, I'm going to use another new unit, which is the FR unit. Now, the FR unit is, again, new for CSS Grid, and it allows us to take a lot of the fractional math out of building out our layouts. So to go through and demonstrate it visually, if I said I have 4 columns, one's 100 pixels, one's 1 FR wide, and another one's 50 pixels, and another one's 2 FR wide, and I want to have a gap of 20 pixels between each of those columns. We're going to touch on the gap a bit more later, but for now, we have a gap between each of them. What the FR unit does is it takes 100% of our element width, which in this case is 510 pixels. We're then going to remove any existing content. So I have 100 pixels and a 50 pixel column. So I'm going to take away 150 pixels. We're then going to remove the gap. Now this is where it's pretty clever, because if I have 4 columns, how many gaps are there? 3. So 3 times 20 pixels is 60 pixels. And then I'm going to go through and divide that by the number of FRs. So I have 1 FR and 2 FR. So I'm going to divide it by 3. Anybody able to do math at this point today? Everyone at the attendee party last night not really wanting to do math today? In this particular layout, that would mean that 1 FR is equal to 100 pixels. So what this does is it will go through, and depending on the size of our container, it will allocate extra space to our FR columns. Now the 1 FR will get half as much space as the 2 FR will. So if I have 270 pixels wide for my container, it'll be 20 pixels and 40 pixels. If I had 300 pixels wide, that additional space would then be allocated to my 1 FR and 2 FR columns according to what the numbers say. Now this is really great because it means we're able to have fixed width columns and the rest of the space can be allocated accordingly. So, really long-winded way of explaining it. Can anyone work out, if I said I want repeat 5, 1 FR, how many columns am I going to have? 5? How wide are they going to be? Are they all going to be the same width? Yes, I'm going to have 5 columns that are all the same width. Now, this won't matter how big my container is. It won't matter how wide the screen is. I'm always going to have 5 columns that are exactly the same width. So if I do grid template columns, repeat 5, 1 FR, my app now looks like this. We can see, because I now have columns, it has gone through and has placed each of the elements in my app, each into a separate column. Next, we're going to go through and have a look at the rows. And remember, we had a look at the rows. We wanted 3, 1 for the header, 1 for the main, and 1 for the footer. So I'm going to use another property, which is grid template rows. And for the header, I want 100 pixels height, sounds good. For the footer, I want 50 pixels high. And I'm going to use the FR unit again for the main body. Can anybody have a guess at what this is going to do? So how tall is the middle section going to be? In this, our middle section will take up all remaining space, which is exactly what we want for the app. We want the header to be a fixed height, we want the footer to be a fixed height, and we want the rest of it to take up any remaining space, which means our app is always going to take up the full height of the screen, and the space is going to be allocated accordingly. Which makes our app look a little bit funky at the moment, because now everything's been pushed into our 100 pixel high row on the top row, and so it's all overflowing a fair bit. So, next, we're going to go through and we're going to lay our elements out into the grid. So to do that, we want the header, first of all, we want the header to take up the full top. If we have a look, my thing's not working. We want the header to take the full width of the page. And I've broken my computer. We want the header to take the full width of the page. And now there are a couple of different ways that we can do this. But first of all, we want to have a look at... I made it full, didn't I? It'll come back. To do that, we need to know that grid lines are numbered in CSS Grid. So they're numbered all the way across the page. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So what we can do is we can tell the grid that we want the header to start here at 1, and we want it to go all the way to the end. So where should it go to? 6. So we're going to use a property called grid column start, and we're going to tell it we want it to start at line 1. Remember, we want it to go all the way to the end, so we could set it to go to line 6, and it would go there. However, CSS Grid has this other great thing where not only are the lines numbered that way, they're numbered back the other way as well. So -1, -2, -3, and so on. Which means if we want it to go all the way to the end, we can tell it to go to line -1. This means that no matter what size the grid is, it's always going to go all the way to the other side. Whether it's 1 column wide or 100 column wide, it's always going to go all the way to the other end. So we're going to set grid column end -1. Now there's a shorthand for this as well. We can say grid column 1/-1, and this will go through and push our header all the way out on the top row. Next, we want to go through and we want to push our nav so that it goes all the way down to the bottom row. So our yellow section, which is our navigation, we want it to go from row 2, because our rows are also numbered, and we want it to go all the way to the bottom. So we could say we want it to go to 4, or we could say we want it to go to -1. So our nav, we're going to say we want grid row 2 to -1. Now, we could also just tell it that we want it to span across 2 rows as well, and we will let it work out where that's going to go. So if we say grid row span 2, our nav is now pushed down onto the bottom row as well. Once that's done, we then want to go through and we want to push the main of our app out. So that takes up the rest of the middle row. And so to do that, we're going to say grid column span 4. We want to span across 4 columns, which is going to push the main section all the way out. And finally, we want to do the same for our footer. So we're going to say footer, grid column span 4. It'll span the remaining 4 rows, which pushes it all the way out the bottom. So that's then filled up our layout as we want in the design. Now, this is really useful, but there's another way we can lay the elements out. Once we've got our columns and our rows defined, we can also use a property called grid template areas, which allows us to assign names to different areas and define whether areas span across multiple sections. So here we have grid template areas. We have 1 string per row with white space separating each of the columns. Now, it's fairly chilled about this, but it is useful to make sure that the columns and rows line up so it's easier to recognize. So here we have header, 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 header. Our nav is on row 2 and 3. Our note takes up the remainder of row 2 and our footer takes up the remainder of row 3. So here we can visualize what we want our layout to look like. Once we've defined the names of these areas, we could then go through to each of our elements and tell it which areas it should take. So header would be grid area header, nav would be grid area nav, main would be grid area note, and footer would be grid area footer, because naming things is really hard. So I'm going with something nice and easy, which would give us the same result. Now, this is where I want to touch on one of the really useful tools, which is Firefox's CSS Grid Inspector tool. Now, this is really useful when you're first getting your head around CSS Grid, because it will allow you to see the different sections on the grid and hover over each of them. When you assign names to different areas, you can also see the names then pop up on the page overlaying on it. And when you hover over different sections, we'll hover over it on the page, including if an area spans across multiple sections. So, we have the basic layout of our app. Done. In 7 lines of CSS. Anybody reckon this was possible before they came in here? 7 lines of CSS for a basic layout? I don't know, that seemed a little bit too good to be true, right? But we have a couple of things that are still not quite done. So if we have a look at our wireframe again, we actually have a note in the main section, and we have a little sidebar on the right-hand side as well with some information about our notes, which isn't what we currently have. So currently we have the note and the sidebar on top of it. So we want them to actually stand next to one another. Now, there are a few different ways that we can do this. We can just go through and create another grid in the section. You can embed grids inside of grids the same way you can embed tables inside of tables. It's just a little bit nicer to deal with. So let's have a look at the HTML for this. We have a main element. Inside of that, we have an article and an aside element. So we want our article to take up a couple of columns and our aside element to sit on the right-hand side. So to do this, we could say display grid and then set grid template columns 3FR, 1FR, our notes 3 times as big as our sidebar, which that would push it out to look the way we want it to. The note takes up the main section, the sidebar sits where it is. However, there's another thing that we can use, which is called Subgrid. So we can go through, and instead of defining the columns, we can say grid template columns subgrid. Now what this does is this inherits how many columns the parent, in this case the main container, spans across. So in our main grid, the main element takes up 4 columns. So if we set grid template columns to be subgrid, it will create 4 equal columns, the exact same columns from the parent grid. So if we do that, that will then push our note and our sidebar into the first 2 columns. So all we have to do then is we can go through and set the article to span 3 columns, and that will push it out again. Now, using subgrid is super useful because it means if I change the size of my overall layout, the number of columns inside the main section will change as well. So this is really useful to go through and play with. Now, Subgrid is relatively new. MDN has some really great docs on it, and I'll have a few more resources later on. There's also some really great blog posts by Rachel Andrew, which I'll share out at the end of the talk. One of the other questions I get a lot is, so then does grid replace Flexbox? Most of the stuff that we've done, we've been doing Flexbox with, so could we just use grid instead? Does this mean that we shouldn't use Flexbox anymore? Now, grid is really awesome for layouts. We've seen that, we've talked about that. But Flexbox is still really awesome for flowing content. Now, they both have their own superpowers, and they actually work best when combined. So for an overall layout like we've just done, CSS Grid hands down is the better option. However, for things like navigation menus, where we've just got a whole lot of things that we want to fit nicely in a row, this is when Flexbox is still really powerful. So for things like aligning our menu items nicely in the navigation, I would still always turn to Flexbox for that. There's no replacement between Flexbox and CSS Grid. They work well together. All right, so we have our app. This is pretty good. If I add a little bit of padding and a few visual points, this is a pretty good layout considering how long it's taken us. While nowhere near a finished product, it's not too bad for the amount of code that we've written so far. But while this is really great for our app, we want to have a full view of all of our notes in a grid. So I want to see what's going on. So I'm going to go through and create another layout for this. I want to have a whole lot of different tiles of each of my notes. And so I'm going to go through and define another grid layout for this view. And I'm going to say grid template columns repeat 10 300 pixels because I want to have a whole lot of notes next to one another, just nice little tiles. Now, the problem with this is it's not super responsive again. If I change the size of my screen, 10 notes all next to one another might actually not give much room. And 300 pixels, that's not really responsive either. However, there is another property which we can use. There are two. There's autofill and autofit. Now, these work slightly similarly to one another, and the way I work out which one I should use is I switch back and forward between each of them until it does what I want it to do. And it's kind of like plugging a USB in. The first way didn't work, so I tried the second way, and that didn't work either. So I go back to the first way, and that one was right. There's a really great CodePen demo, which I'm going to share at the end as well, by Sarah Sowerden, which shows the difference. So autofill, which is at the top, autofit is at the bottom. As we increase the size of our container, and excusing my janky computer screen recording, autofill will increase to put as many items as it can on that row, as long as it has those elements. Like, even if, so autofill will increase and create additional columns in its grid, even if it doesn't have the items to put there. So we can see there's a whole lot of space at the end of the first row because you could technically fit other elements, they're just not there. Autofit will increase to put additional items on the row, but once it runs out of elements to put there, it'll just make them bigger. So they'll continue to expand to take up the remaining space. So in this case, I want to use autofill because I want it to put a whole bunch of columns even if I don't need them yet. So in this case, I want to say repeat autofill 300 pixels. So I want to put as many 300 pixel wide columns as you can fit in the grid. Now, taking into account the fact that I want it to be a little bit responsive, like if you've got 250 pixels remaining, it's not quite enough for a column, but I don't want a whole bunch of space on the edge. So I'm also going to use the min-max function, which, as the name suggests, allows me to define a minimum and a maximum. So a minimum of 100 pixels and a maximum of 20 viewport widths in this case, which means as long as it's 100 pixels wide, it would then expand up to 20 viewport widths. Or I could say 100 pixels as a minimum, 1 FR as a maximum. Now this is really great because it means they'll grow the same size until it can fit another 100 pixels on the end. I can use whatever CSS units I like in min-max. It will continue to work the same way. So if I say min-max 300 pixels, 1 FR, the column will be at least 300 pixels wide, but if it doesn't quite have 300 pixels, the additional space will be spread equally between each of the columns. Like this. I have a whole bunch of tiles next to one another, and the columns are all equal width. Now, I then want to go through and define the rows because I want them to be a nice little square size, and I want to say repeat autofill 150 pixels. In this case, 150 pixels is a good height, I reckon, so I'm going to go through and set that. Now, this is looking pretty good, but it's a little bit squished, so we're going to talk about gaps. And so I'm going to use grid column gap to set a gap of 20 pixels. Can anyone have a guess of what this is going to do? Come on, people, it's almost lunchtime. Don't fall asleep yet. It's going to add a gap of 20 pixels between each of the rows, each of the columns. It's going to put 20 pixels between each of the columns. I then also have another property, grid row gap, which, surprise, surprise, would put 20 pixel gap between each of the rows. Once again, I have a shorthand property of grid gap, which would add 20 pixels between each of the rows and columns if I want it to be the same. Now, question of, is grid gap better than using a margin? Now, anybody tried to get margins right? It's great because on the parent you've got to add the negative margin to give it additional space, and then the child you've got to add the margin to it. So that will manage to equal it out. Or if you know how many you're going to have in each row, you can set the margin to be 10 pixels on each of the children. But you could then say for every 5, don't have a margin on the right, and then for every 5 plus 1, don't have a margin on the left. And then for the first 5, don't put a margin on the top. So being able to just go through and do grid gap, it's a little bit nicer to deal with. And this is going to add a nice little gap between each of my notes, just space things out nicely. White space isn't bad, just the right amount. It's like eating Vegemite, not too much, not too little, just the right amount. This is where Grid Inspector is also super useful again, because we're able to actually visualize where our gap is. And we can see here, it's actually created a whole lot of sections on my grid that I don't actually need yet. This is really useful because my grid will continue to stay the same size, and I'll be able to just go through and add additional notes on it. Now, sounds pretty awesome, right? Clearly there has to be a catch, doesn't there? Browser support. Every developer's favorite word. So browser support is actually doing pretty good for CSS Grid. So Chrome has had it since version 57, Firefox since 52, Safari since 10.1, Edge since 16, and that's all the browsers, right? I haven't missed one. So, would it surprise you that Internet Explorer has had CSS Grid since version 10? Sort of. I'm going to talk a little bit about this one in a minute. This comes to about 97% globally. So this is pretty good. This is pretty amazing for CSS Grid support. Now, the one catch, the really awesome subgrid that I talked about, that I hyped up, that's really amazing. So that one, the browser support is not as good on. It is actually in Safari now, which I was very surprised by. It's been in Firefox since 71. It's been in Safari since 16. Chromium currently have, they're talking about it, but no one will give an answer on whether or not they're actually working on it. So if you know anybody who works on any of the Chromium teams, please tell them we need Subgrid. And you didn't think Internet Explorer was going to have it, did you? Now, the great thing about this is even if the browser doesn't support it, we have another CSS feature, which is the supports query. Now, this allows us to go through and check whether or not a particular browser supports a CSS property and a value. We put our code inside of it. And that way, if the browser doesn't know what to do with the property and the value, it'll ignore the code. Now, the irony is not all browsers support the supports query, but the great thing is if the browser doesn't support the supports query, it's not going to support CSS Grid. So I can go through and go supports display grid and put all my CSS Grid code inside of it. And then if the browser doesn't know what to do with display grid, it's just going to ignore all of my code, which means I'm not going to deliver unsupported code to a browser. Now, the catch is this guy again. So, fun fact, Internet Explorer was the first browser to implement the CSS Grid spec. Shocking, I know. They implemented it way, way back in version 1 of the spec. Now, through the various different iterations until it got released, the spec changed a fair bit, i.e. didn't update their implementation of it. So what happens is Internet Explorer thinks it can do grid, but the way it does it is completely differently to how we would expect it. Now, you can find their version of implementation if you are bored or having trouble sleeping and would like to read about whether or not that might still fit your use case. But there are also ways where we can get around it. Because what happens if we go through and do a supports query for display grid, Internet Explorer sees that and goes, oh, grid, I've got that, I can do that, I can do this code. And then it goes through and processes the code and does things completely differently to how you're expecting it. So instead, we can do a supports query for a different property, like grid template areas, that Internet Explorer doesn't know what to do with. And it can go through, so we go display grid inside of that, and Internet Explorer will ignore it like we want it to, and it can go back and have the boring fallback layout that it's had previously. So, now that we've gone through all of that, time to sum up what we've covered. CSS Grid is awesome. That was it, right? That was it? All jokes aside, CSS Grid is amazing and is revolutionizing what we do in CSS. If you haven't touched CSS in a while, I highly recommend having a look at the changes, because there are a whole lot of things that we can do now that we hadn't been able to do before. And hopefully I might get to come back next year with my new talk about the other new things in CSS, and you can come and learn about them next year. There are a lot of amazing resources out there as well. I'm going to flick through a couple of them, and I'm also going to tweet my slides out at the end of the session. Actually, it's probably already gone out, so you can find the resources there. CSS Tricks has a really amazing guide to grid. If you're struggling with CSS, highly recommend anything on CSS Tricks. They also have it available as a poster, which, yes, I do have the CSS Guide to Grid and Guide to Flexbox as posters in my office, and I don't have any bad feelings about that. I'm really okay with that. If you enjoy doing video tutorials, Wes Boss, who does a whole bunch of JavaScript courses, has a free CSS Grid course. That's a great one to check out. If you prefer reading things, A Book Apart has a really amazing book, The New CSS Layout, by Rachel Andrew. Pretty much anything by Rachel Andrew or by Jen Simmons is a great place to go. They are two of the amazing people heavily involved with the implementation of CSS Grid. If you would like to have a little bit more fun, there's CSS Grid Garden, which allows you to go through and learn CSS Grid while watering gardens and killing plants. So that when your boss walks past and goes, "Why are you playing a game at work?" be like, no, this is learning. This is personal development time. If you want to brush up or learn a little bit more about Flexbox, the same creator also made Flexbox Froggy, where you can put frogs on lily pads using Flexbox. I also have a repo of the code that we went through today available on GitHub. There is also a branch, I think it's called Talk. There is a Talk branch on there which steps through each of the steps that we went through today in different commits if you'd like to step through them again. Thank you very much for having me today. I hope you enjoyed the session. Do I have a little bit of time for questions?
There's no time for questions,
No time for
unfortunately.
questions.
Otherwise, people are going to get really hungry. But
Yeah.
you're going to be around during the day?
I will. I'm going to go and dump my laptop in my room, but then I will absolutely be hanging around the conference for the rest of the day. If you would like to come and ask me any questions, I also have stickers and Tim Tams as well.
Stickers.
And Tim Tams.
And I've never tried a Tim Tam. I need to get one of those from you.
Wow.
Okay.
Missing out, Stacey. Yes. So thank you very much for coming along. If you have any questions, come up and find me afterwards.
And thank you, everybody. It's time for lunch, and we'll be back in an hour.